If you knew for sure that there was nothing after death, no heaven, no hell, no judgment, would you live your life any differently? A close friend of mine asked me that the other day, and after thinking about it for a while, I realized there's more depth to the question than first meets the eye. My first intuition was that almost every single person asked this question would actually answer no, regardless of whether they actually would or not. To understand why, I think that we first need to understand what saying yes would mean. Today, I want to talk about ethical frameworks and why not having one properly fleshed out is costing you time and reputation. But before we get too far into the ethical frameworks themselves, I want to swing back to the question we heard a second ago. If somebody answered that they would live differently, the implication is that knowing somebody is watching is the main driver of their life, or at the very least, their ethics. Now, I think that everybody on some fundamental level wants to believe that they are internally consistent. If you doubt this, just tell any one of your friends that they're being hypocritical, even if they're not. I can almost guarantee you that their reaction will be defensive and probably not calm. If they really didn't care at all, they'd brush it off, just like if you said the sky was blue. But instead, they'll desperately try to convince you that they are, in fact, consistent. A quick dark psychology tip that goes with this is if you're ever debating somebody and they're already using dirty tactics on you, question their internal consistency in a way that makes it look like they don't actually practice what they preach. Even though it's not quite a valid argument, it will convince them that they need to be in a more defensive position, and it will stop them from attacking your points momentarily. Bonus points if there's people listening. Anyways, where I'm going with this is if you act differently knowing that you're being observed, you're obviously not going to be internally consistent, and nobody wants to appear that way. Unfortunately, that's a lot easier said than done. However, one way that we can become more internally consistent and absolutely dunk on our friends that say otherwise is to adhere to an ethical framework. I'm going to go over 4 popular frameworks today that should give you a really strong starting point to work from and give you the upper hand over people that don't utilize any framework. I'm also going to go over some attack angles for these frameworks in case you come across somebody who tries to use them against you. The first one I wanted to go over was utilitarianism. Out of all of these, I think you're the most likely to have heard of this one, so I'll try not to drone on about it too much. Utilitarianism can best be described as prioritizing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. An example of this would be if one person or country was hoarding loads of wealth or goods, then they would be ethically obligated to redistribute those goods until it would cause them to suffer more than the people that they are redistributing to. A simpler version of this, if you're familiar with it, would actually be the trolley problem. Under utilitarianism, we'd be ethically obligated to pull the lever and kill 1 instead of 5, because presumably those 5 would go on to collectively experience 5 times the pleasure of the one whose life is getting cut short. On a more personal note, I think that this is the most naive of the 4 that I'm going to go over today. It sounds beautiful when you first hear it, but it does have some major flaws. One problem that highlights a few of them is the utility monster. Say that there was a being that received much more pleasure and pain than any human per unit of utility. If you were to give a normal person an apple, they would say get, maybe 1 unit of pleasure. The utility monster, however, would receive 100 or even 1,000 units of pleasure per apple. Utilitarianism dictates that we would actually have to give all of our apples to this monster, because it receives far more pleasure from it than any person could dream of. Obviously, I hope you can see how utilitarianism, without any room for nuance here, is not exactly my favorite framework. The next one I find a little bit more interesting, and I hope you do too. Regardless of your feelings about it, I think we can all agree that deontology is one of the coolest names for an ethical framework. Jokes aside, deontology is kind of the antithesis of utilitarianism. If utilitarianism, if in utilitarianism the ends justify the means, then in deontology, pretty much there is only the means. And, what I mean by that is that deontology argues that there are certain duties that we all have regardless of the consequences. Now, I try not to name drop too much on this channel just because I want to keep everything I'm talking about accessible without you having to feel like you have to read 10 books just to understand the point that I'm making. That said, I do have to mention that this particular flavor of deontology that I'm talking about here was largely created and popularized by Immanuel Kant. He believed that before making a decision that involved other people, you have to ask yourself if the type of action that you're about to take could be made in every single similar situation. No exceptions. Put simply, if you're about to tell a white lie, you have to ask yourself if telling a lie because you think that it's what the other person wants to hear is acceptable, and not only acceptable, but should be done every single time by every single person. If the answer is no, then simply you shouldn't do it. If yes, you're free to proceed. There are a few sticky situations that this could put you in, though. Imagine a man is starving on the street, and the only way that he can get food is to steal it. The deontological argument says that that's stealing, period. And if everybody stole all of the time, and they stole everything, that wouldn't be acceptable. And because it wouldn't be acceptable, this too would also not be acceptable. No ifs, ands, or buts. I think on some level, both deontology and utilitarianism are both very black and white, which is one of my biggest critiques when it comes to ethical frameworks, but I can absolutely understand why some people might want a system that is black and white. It makes ethical dilemmas a piece of cake, honestly, and potentially can take all of the emotional work out of solving them, which has its ups and downs. Wherever you stand on these two frameworks, I think understanding them, either defensively or offensively, is important if you want to sound even remotely educated in conversations about ethics. Now, whatever friends you still have after discussing these frameworks with them are probably pretty interesting people. So, my condolences for the rest of your friends, and you're welcome for the remaining ones. Next up, I wanted to talk about social contract theory. I like to think of social contract theory as less of an ethical framework and more of an explanation of ethical frameworks. I think it's quite important to bring this up in this video just because of the influence that it's held in Western culture for hundreds of years. Imagine, if you will, that every single person in the world is completely selfish. However, they're also rational, and they want to produce the best possible world for themselves. Each person, for their own self-interest, is technically possible for them to steal, rape, kill, or any other horrible thing that you can think of. However, the rational person thinks to themselves, hey, if I were to go around stealing, raping, and killing, and everyone else thinks the same as me, this won't really turn out well for any of us. Thus, the social contract is born. Hey, neighbor, I'm not going to take your things and hurt you if you don't take my things and hurt me. Deal? Long story short, Everybody is bound by this social contract in the interest of meeting everybody's selfish needs. Sounds pretty simple. No? Well, what if somebody does decide to steal even while understanding that it breaks the social contract? Well, first, you're going to need somebody to enforce that social contract. Then you're going to need a clear, preferably written version of that contract to be enforced. And what if Group A bands together and decides that they want X to be in the social contract, but Group B thinks that X is stupid and has no place in the social contract? Now, we either have to have different social contracts for different groups of people, or have hierarchies of social contracts that would make it so that there's one social contract that everyone can agree on, and then a location or group-specific contract that specific people can agree on. I suppose I should also mention the third option of warring over whose social contract is better, but I think that we can all agree that it's much nicer for all those involved to exercise their freedom of association. All in all, social contract theory roughly states that ethics should be derived from this contract that we formed and can be amended if needs be. It's a form of relativism, actually, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's essentially just saying that, maybe there's nothing that's objectively right or wrong. It's simply up to the social contract that you're bound by. That, however, opens its own can of worms about democracy and how everyone agreeing on something doesn't necessarily make it good or right, but that's a whole nother video for another time that I might do. Last but not least, I wanted to go over virtue ethics. Virtue ethics can be summed up by saying that good people just do good things. And it has less to do with figuring out what those things are that are good or bad on an individual basis, and more to do with becoming a good person in general. It does seem a little unspecific and like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. But if you stick with me here, there is some substance here, I think. Socrates, who you don't have to read to understand this, said that to figure out what was right in any given situation, you just had to find the midpoint between the two extremes presented. For instance, if you were walking past an alleyway and you saw somebody getting mugged, you'd have to ask yourself what a good person would do here. Say that the answer to your question is that they would be brave. The two extremes in this situation would be something like run into the alleyway and attempt to take down the mugger yourself, or run away in fear. Socrates would argue that the right thing to do is to find the middle point in between these two. In this case, maybe calling the police and saying, telling them about what's happening, and then staying at the ready if you're forced to defend yourself. The reason why that might be the right thing to do is because that's what a brave person would do. I do think that there are a few flaws with this reasoning, like how do you decide what traits are good? But Socrates argues that we already know the answer to that, and we can actually always feel the pull of goodness, and that's just true whether we acted on it or not. At the end of the day, none of these are perfect, because if they were, you'd hope that everyone would be on the same page. Regardless of which one you think is the correct ethical framework, or your favorite one, I think it's important to have one. Having a moral compass without a needle is not only a great way to get people to question your every move, but also have you excessively questioning your own moves. And honestly, that's no way to live. I'd love to hear what ethical framework, on or off of this list, is the most useful or interesting to you in the comments. Until next time, never stop thinking.